Thank you, Lynn. Oh, and by the way, Lynn brought some candy and put them on the table in the back. She says they're retirement mints. She says she wasn't really aiming them at me, but maybe. How many of you have ever figured you'd really like to live a life that matters, that really makes a difference in the world around you? That's good. I'm glad I see some hands. And how would you define matters, a life that matters? Is it, where across society everybody knows the name of Caleb Geddert, for decades people talk about Caleb and the impact he had, or is a life that matters, as long as my family, as long as I've made a difference in their life or my friends. There's different ways of defining a life that matters, leaving a legacy, that kind of stuff. And some of us figure, well, no, that's not for me. Probably all of us would like to make a difference somewhere. Most of us have no illusions about having, a broad impact on society. And most of the people who do have visions of that are misguided in a way. But sometimes it does happen. I think we should all desire to live a life that matters, but not for selfish reasons, and there's a difference there. And I'm not going to worry too much about that one. What do you need to live a life that matters? So that, what do you need to have so that you can matter to the people around you or to the world around you? How much money do you need so that you can have an impact on other people? How much power and influence do you, if I was in that position, if I was the Prime Minister of Canada, oh my goodness. But we have these visions of if I was there, or if I was in that position, or if I had this bank account, or then I could make a difference in the world around me. So today, I'm going to invite you to look, first of all, I'm going to read a couple of verses out of the prophet Micah. And a lot of you know these verses. And then we're going to look at a different person in the Old Testament and talk about a life that matters. Micah chapter 6, and starting at verse 6, "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Let's pray. Father, as we look into your word and we consider these verses and also the life of Daniel, we pray that you would bless our understanding and our application, Father. In Jesus' name, amen. Micah is, how grand, how great, how extravagant do I have to be in my worship for God to be pleased? And then he says, it's actually not that complicated. I have, on a couple of occasions at least, had conversations with individuals about that verse 8 there. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. And they were conversations with people who had grand visions of making this huge impact on society. The ones I remember having a conversation with never liked this verse. It's too simple. It couldn't be that simple. Just do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Somehow too dull. So now let's think about Daniel. Daniel in the Old Testament. You have heard about Daniel before, I'm sure. Daniel is a fascinating individual. I love looking at his life story. So a few things about Daniel by way of introduction. Daniel was born in Jerusalem. He was a Jew. He was of noble birth. He was a prince. He wasn't in line to be the next king, most likely, depending on how many would die. But he was of noble birth and well situated to really have an impact on his nation. He was well situated to be a person of influence, to be a person whose life would matter. You know, he could start charitable organizations and foundations for the poor, and he could do all these things as having noble birth in Jerusalem, and he could make a real difference. We're told later that he was actually also very good looking and exceptionally bright. So totally everything was going for Daniel. Except then everything is shattered. His city and his nation is attacked and defeated. The army from Babylon had come. They weren't just aiming at Jerusalem, they were aiming at other things too. The guy leading the army was Nebuchadnezzar. He was not yet the king. He was the son of the king in Babylon. But they attacked Jerusalem. They defeated Jerusalem. I don't know how extensive the destruction was, but they took a lot of slaves back to Babylon with them and a lot of treasures out of the house of God, out of the temple. Subsequently, they had made a treaty with Jerusalem. Okay, you pay us taxes, we won't beat you up anymore. And Egypt, further south, was one of the other big powers in the world at the time. Jerusalem was kind of caught in the middle. And there's all kinds of politics involved with that. So then there was a period of time, okay, backing up, Nebuchadnezzar, the prince, I'm not sure if he was planning to go all the way to Egypt and take them down too. But then he got news that his father, the king, had died back home, so better get back home quick and get installed as the king before somebody else steps into that place. So that ended that. And then for about 20, 25 years, there was this uneasy relationship with Babylon, between Babylon and Jerusalem. Babylon and Jerusalem made a treaty. Yes, we'll pay so and so much. And then Jerusalem got a different king, and somebody gave him bad advice and said, you break that treaty and you stick with Egypt over there. And so Babylon came a couple of times, attacking, threatening, making treaties, etc. The time when Daniel was taken as a slave was kind of the first of those major battles between Babylon and Jerusalem. Anyway, Daniel is taken away as a captured slave with a lot of others. How is he now supposed to make a difference in his world? Any visions he had of having an impact were shattered. A slave has no rights. He's in a foreign country, learning to speak a strange language, learning a different culture. Everything that he might have dreamed of is gone. You think Daniel knew the story of Joseph? I'll bet he did. Did he see himself maybe in that story now? I don't know. Did he have enough insight to recognize that maybe not all was lost? I don't know that either. But you can have a lot of thoughts in the march from Jerusalem to Babylon. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And I know it says king. But when you read the history, he was actually the crown prince who had to hurry home and get crowned. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles of the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. They're picking from these slaves the best and the brightest. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And of course, they were given new names because they're now in a new land, part of assimilating them into a different culture. The story takes no time to describe the horror of being attacked in Jerusalem. It says nothing about the devastation that happened in Jerusalem, just that he attacked and defeated and took the treasures from the temple. The writer says nothing about the long march. How many died along the way? What kind of things were they subjected to? It doesn't say anything about that. The human interest things that we find in our novels, they're not in there. Apparently, we don't need to hear about those. We just know there's Daniel and his friends who are now in a strange city, displaced from their own land. Maybe their families were killed, maybe not. Daniel's story begins with the absence of privilege and the absence of power. It begins with slavery and the loss of everything familiar and the loss of all personal rights. And then Daniel and his friends enter the king's service as wise men. By the way, how many kings did Daniel serve under? Any guesses? Dawson's counting. It depends which book you look at or which article you're reading or whatever. It could be as many as 10. Different kings that Daniel served under as a wise man from 2 different empires, because halfway down, Babylon was defeated by the Persian Empire. And Daniel still served as an advisor to the new kings, which I don't understand how that culture worked. But there was a lot of turnover. And Daniel is caught in the middle of that. Would you ever just give up? Would you ever just say, what's the point? My God abandoned my people when Jerusalem was destroyed. Well, first attacked. About 20 years later, Nebuchadnezzar came back, and then he did destroy Jerusalem. Why even try? But as Daniel's story is told, we learn something about him. And I think we learn something about what's needed to make an impact, to have a life that makes an impact. So just a few of the things about Daniel. Chapter 1, verse 5. I read that one already. I will repeat. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. And then verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Daniel had discipline. I know they want me to eat this stuff. I don't think this stuff is good for me. But he didn't demand it. He didn't say, I'll rather die than eat your food. He asked for permission. And God had given Daniel a good reputation in the eyes of this official. So he said, okay. The official was reluctant. He said, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than all the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. And he says, just test us. Give us 10 days. Daniel was disciplined. Instead of just becoming assimilated into the culture, he said, I would rather not participate in this or this or this. How disciplined are we? How easy is it to let ourselves get assimilated into the culture around us, just to become like everybody else, whether it's in morals or anything else? Pretty easy. Daniel had discipline. Even as a slave, he had discipline. Chapter 2. In the second year of his reign, this is Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel has been here for a while, and it's the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. He had been crowned just a little while ago. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. So they all come, and they say, okay, tell us what your dream was. Nebuchadnezzar, a new king, for whatever reason, says, actually, I'm not sure you guys are trustworthy. So you tell me what I dreamt, and then you tell me what it means, and then I'll know you're the real deal. Otherwise, I don't believe you. Maybe it was a way for the new king to assert his control. Maybe it was a way for the new king to weed out all the wannabe wise men. I don't know. Verse 10, the astrologers answered the king, there is not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men. That was their theology. They had the nerve to tell the king, you're being unreasonable. Come on, tell us what you dreamt, and we'll tell you what it means. The king says, well, if you can't do that, I'm going to have you all executed, all the wise men, and we're going to start over. That's in verse 12. So the decree was issued, verse 13, was issued to put the wise men to death. And men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death because they were part of this whole group of wise men. Daniel says, what's going on? The guard explains what's just happened. Daniel sends a message to the king, can you give me a little bit of time? And Daniel goes to his friends and he says, here's the deal. The king's had a dream and he wants us to tell him what he dreamt. And nobody has any idea what it is, but we need to pray. So they prayed. Daniel had faith. He prayed and God gave him insight. God told him what the king had dreamt and what the dream meant. Not only did Daniel have faith in God, he also said to the guards, don't kill the wise men just yet. Wouldn't this have been the perfect opportunity to wipe out all the opposition? All these fake wise men? Yeah, go ahead, you kill all of them, just leave me and my friends, and we'll tell the king. He said, don't kill anybody just yet. There was faith, there was benevolence. He was kind. Even though all these other wise men did not believe in the God Daniel believed in. They said, the gods do not live among men. Daniel said, actually, he does. So Daniel had discipline. Daniel had faith. He trusted God. Daniel had benevolence. He was kind. Chapter 4. The king has another dream. He has this long part of the book that actually comes from the king's own words. Verse 10, chapter 4, these are the visions I saw while lying on my bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. And he goes on and describes this dream that he had. And then in verse 19, then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Obviously, Daniel's facial expressions it was easy to read. He was terrified. He didn't want to tell the king what this dream meant. The king says, just go ahead and tell me anyway. He could have lied. He could have invented anything he wanted. But the fourth thing that was noticeable about Daniel is his honesty. He wouldn't lie. The dream had all kinds of things about the king's future. And Daniel told him exactly the way it was. And it happened exactly the way it did. So Daniel had discipline, he had faith, he had benevolence, he was honest. Chapter 5. In chapter 5, we see he had courage. King Belshazzar, the name is very close to Daniel's name, Belteshazzar. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. And if you read history, you're not quite sure whether this guy was actually the king or the crown prince who was left in charge of the kingdom. Either way, he was not a good guy. So he has this great party for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While he was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, or more accurately, his ancestor, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. They were using the utensils, the goblets, the bowls, the cups that had been dedicated to God in the temple in Jerusalem. They used them in a drunken orgy, and they praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Verse 5, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale. He was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. And maybe it could have been added in brackets, and suddenly he was dead, cold, sober. But I don't know that. Daniel gets called in. Do you know what that is? He says, yes, I do. Tell me what it is. The king had promised great rewards to whoever could interpret this strange writing. Daniel says, you can keep your rewards. I don't need them. Give them to somebody else. But this is what it means. It means your kingdom will be taken from you tonight. Daniel had, can you imagine the nerve? You're standing before the guy who at a word can have your head chopped off. Tell me what it means. He tells him. That takes a lot of nerve. It takes a lot of courage. Discipline, faith, benevolence, honesty, courage. Another thing that I'm just going to add, because it's kind of woven throughout his story, is humility. Daniel never promoted his own interests. He never tried to get rid of the other astrologers and the other wise men to promote himself. He was willing to say what needed to be said and leave it at that. So he was also humble. Chapter 6. Daniel is now under a different king. The Persian Empire has defeated the Babylonian Empire. And there is Darius, who's king now. And he appoints 120 different people to rule the kingdom as his ministers and stuff. And Daniel distinguished himself again. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom, verse 3. So all the other wise men, here they are because it's Persian now, they are called satraps and all kinds of other different kinds of titles. They don't like the competition. We should get rid of Daniel. So they look for something to condemn him for. There's got to be a flaw in him somewhere. You know, it's like politicians who are looking for some way to dig up some dirt on the opposition. And they look and they look and they can find nothing. Eventually, verse 5, finally these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. They recognize that his character was unimpeachable. But he worships his God. So they go to the king and they give the king a bit of an ego trip and they say, why don't you make a rule that for 30 days, everybody in the kingdom has to worship only you. And if anybody worships a different God in these 30 days, they're going to be thrown to the lions. Well, the king, that's a bit of an ego trip. And besides that, let's unite the empire under one religion. Verse 10, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem 3 times a day. He got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. He knew the law. He knew what would happen. He had devotion to God. This is more important to me than my own life. And then there's the story of him getting thrown into the lion's den and God's angel protecting him from the lions. How many of these things are available to us? You want to make an impact in the world. What do you need to make an impact in the world? Daniel, discipline, faith, benevolence, honesty, courage, humility, and devotion to God. You could list all kinds of other things about Daniel. Maybe you could shorten the list into something a little more concise. Those things are all available to us. Those things don't require any great position, any great intelligence, any great bank account, they are available to all of us. Discipline, faith, benevolence, honesty, courage, humility, and devotion to God. Daniel was called to a unique ministry. Very few people in history have been called to a ministry like that. Most of us, if we want to live a life that matters, it'll be a fairly small influence. That makes it no less important. It's just different. The same characteristics are available to us, and if we live and exemplify the same characteristics, we can make a difference around us. Back to Micah. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? Micah boils it down to just 3. But it's still there. It's available to all of us. Worship team, please come on up.